I'd always heard that when you see a tornado, the best thing to do is take shelter. Never, ever try to outrun it in a car. But that afternoon, when I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the swirling cloud descending from the sky, my survival instinct kicked in. I never thought I'd be one of those people with a survival story to tell. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, a quiet place where tornadoes were just TV alerts that popped up from time to time. My family was always cautious, of course, and we had a basement ready for emergencies, but I never thought I'd actually need to use it, at least not until that afternoon. It was early May, and the day had started sunny like any other. I was home alone, enjoying my day off, when the weather began to change. The sky, once bright blue, started to grow heavy and dark, with clouds forming way too fast. Within minutes, the wind began to pick up, and I felt that strange sensation in the air, like nature itself was holding its breath. The first alert came on my phone, an emergency message warning of a possible tornado in the area. My mom always said not to wait for more signs. As soon as we hear the alert, we go straight to the basement. Alone in that moment, I knew what I needed to do, but a part of me was still in denial. I looked out the window and saw the trees bending in the wind, yet something held me in place. That's when the town siren started to blare, that long, steady wail that seemed to cut through the silence. My heart raced, and that's when I realized I didn't have any more time. I ran to the basement, trying to stay calm, but the fear was already starting to build inside me. I slammed the basement door shut and huddled in the corner, between some boxes of supplies and old flashlights. The wind outside began to howl, and the whole house shook with the gusts. I could hear the windows rattling and the sound of something banging against the walls. But the worst part came when the noise started to change. Suddenly, it wasn't just the wind anymore. It was like a roar, a deep, almost deafening sound, as if the air itself was being sucked out of the house. The floor began to vibrate, and I could feel the pressure in the air shifting, like everything around me was about to be torn apart. I closed my eyes and covered my head, trying to make myself as small as possible. And then, everything exploded. A boom so loud that my ears rang. The basement ceiling shook, and I could hear the sound of wood splintering, glass shattering, and something, maybe the roof, being ripped off. I was there, curled up on the floor, and all I could think was, this is real, this is happening. The noise lasted what felt like hours, but it must have been just a few minutes. The deafening sound finally began to fade, and then silence. A silence that felt heavy, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I stayed still, too afraid to move, too afraid to see what had happened to my house, my street, my life. Finally, I worked up the courage to stand. My legs were shaking, and I could barely keep my balance. I climbed the steps slowly, each one harder than the last, and when I opened the basement door, the fresh air hit me like a punch. Sunlight was pouring directly into the house, or what was left of it. The roof was gone. The walls were shattered, and the floor was covered in debris. Everything was upside down, furniture destroyed, pieces of wood and metal scattered everywhere. And the most terrifying thing of all, the street in front of the house was simply gone. It was as if a giant hand had swept through and wiped everything away, leaving only destruction and a strange emptiness. I stepped out of the house, still in shock, and looked around. The neighborhood I had known my whole life was unrecognizable. Trees torn out by the roots, cars flipped over, houses destroyed. It was a war zone. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. The tornado had taken everything. Even the sound of the world seemed to have disappeared. Since that day, the warning sirens have never sounded the same to me. Every time the sky darkens or the wind starts to pick up, my heart races, and I'm transported back to that moment, to the roar of the wind, the unbearable pressure in the air, and the deadly silence that followed. I never imagined I'd get caught in a tornado, especially out in the open, with nowhere to hide. I'd always watched the news about disasters like this, seeing cities ravaged and homes destroyed, but I never thought something like that would happen to me. I grew up in a small town in the countryside, where tornadoes were common, but they were always just a distant scare, until that afternoon. It was early summer, and the day was hot and muggy. I had decided to take a hike across an open field nearby. The sky was clear when I left the house, a crystal blue that promised a peaceful day. Everything seemed normal, but by mid-afternoon, clouds started forming rapidly, almost eerily. At first, they were small dark spots on the horizon. Then, within minutes, the sky was blanketed by a thick layer of dark, heavy clouds. I was far from home, in the middle of a vast field, no trees or hills, just tall grass stretching as far as my eyes could see. When I heard the first clap of thunder, I felt a knot in my chest. I checked my phone for the weather, but there was no signal. The wind started to pick up, first as a gentle breeze, then as strong gusts that bent the grass around me. I knew I had to turn back, but there wasn't enough time. The sound came before the sight, a roar, like a train speeding toward me. At first I couldn't believe it. I looked around, and at first I saw nothing. But then, on the horizon, a dark column of dust and debris was forming, growing quickly, twisting into a monstrous spiral that was heading directly toward me. It was a tornado, a massive tornado, and I was completely exposed. My body froze. Fear gripped me in a way I had never felt before. I always imagined that in extreme situations, I'd know what to do. But there, alone in that open field, there was nowhere to run, no shelter to protect me. Just the flat ground and the darkening sky. The roar of the tornado grew louder, closer, and I knew I had to do something. Anything. I started running. There was no right direction, I was just running, trying to escape the wind that now seemed to be everywhere. Every time I looked back, the dark column was closer, swallowing everything in its path. The ground was shaking, and the sound was deafening, like the air itself was being torn apart. I knew I couldn't outrun it. With no other option, I threw myself to the ground, lying flat in the tall grass and covering my head with my arms, like we'd been taught in disaster drills at school. It was all I could do. The wind was so strong I could feel the ground vibrating beneath me. The pressure in the air changed. My ears started to hurt, as if the very environment around me was being distorted. Then came the impact. The wind yanked me with a force I had never experienced. I felt my body being dragged a few feet, like a leaf caught in a storm. I held on to the grass, my nails digging into the earth, trying somehow to resist. But the tornado was relentless. Things I couldn't see, maybe branches, stones, or debris, struck me, cutting into my skin, making me scream. And then suddenly, everything stopped. The roar was still there, but it was distant, as if the tornado had left me behind. I lay there on the ground, motionless, my body aching, my heart racing wildly. My head was spinning, and for a moment I couldn't tell if I was alive or not. I stood up slowly, trembling, my body still in shock. The field around me was unrecognizable. The ground was torn apart, as if something had ripped the earth with its bare hands. Trees that once stood in the distance were now just broken trunks, tossed like matchsticks. And me? I was there, standing in the middle of it all, miraculously alive. But the silence that came after, that silence was worse than the tornado. The sky was still dark, but the wind had vanished, and everything was still. The emptiness the tornado left behind was terrifying. There were no sounds of birds, no wind, nothing. It was as if the world had stopped. I spent the next few hours wandering through the field in a state of shock. When I finally found a road, a rescue truck appeared and took me to the hospital. They said I was lucky, but sometimes I wonder if it was luck at all. The physical scars have healed, but the sound of the wind, that hellish roar, still haunts me. When I close my eyes, I can feel it again, pulling me away. I was driving back home after a long week of work, and it started like any other day. The sky was partly cloudy, but nothing unusual. I was on the main road, a deserted highway cutting through the open fields of the countryside. When I saw the first dark clouds forming on the horizon, I thought it was just a regular storm. But as the minutes passed, the clouds grew more menacing and the rain started to fall. First it was thick, spaced-out drops, which quickly turned into a downpour. I could barely see through the windshield. Then the lightning started, slicing through the sky in bursts of light. I turned on the radio to check the news, and that's when I heard the warning. Tornado, a big one, moving fast. and it was heading my way. My heart started to race. I knew there was a community shelter about 10 kilometers from where I was, so I stepped on the gas, trying to reach it before the tornado caught up. The wind began to howl around the car, and I could feel the vehicle swaying with every gust. The trees lining the road bent violently, and the fields around me seemed to be in a rage. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. That monstrous funnel of clouds and debris tearing through the land, coming directly toward me. The sky was so dark, it felt like night, except for the lightning illuminating the tornado, revealing its destructive force. It was enormous, bigger than I could have ever imagined. There wasn't time. I knew deep down I wouldn't be able to outrun it. My hands trembled on the steering wheel and panic took over. I tried to stay calm, but the sound was horrifying. It was like the roar of 1,000 engines, a noise that vibrated in my chest and made my bones shake. I knew the tornado was close. The radio went silent, and the rain was now horizontal, slamming against the car with unbelievable force. That's when the car started to move. The wind lifted it slightly, making the tires skid across the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it didn't help. The tornado was pulling me in like the car was a toy. The roar was deafening now, and I could feel the pressure inside the car shift, like the air was being sucked out. I gripped the steering wheel as hard as I could, but I knew I was about to be swept away. And then, it all happened at once. The car was tossed to the side like a soda can. I felt the world spin around me as the car twirled through the air. Glass shattered, debris flew in through the windows, and the sound of metal bending was terrifying. My screams were swallowed by the roar of the tornado, and all I could do was curl up and hope to survive. When the car finally hit the ground, it was with such brutal force that I lost all sense of where I was. Everything went dark for a few seconds. Somehow, I was still conscious. The car was upside down, the windows shattered, and the inside was covered in mud, leaves, and debris. The pain in my body was unbearable, but I knew I had to get out of there fast. I stood up with difficulty, my whole body shaking. I looked at what was left of my car. It was crushed, unrecognizable, as if it had been tossed by a giant. The tornado had disappeared into the horizon, but the sound of the wind and the roar still echoed in my head. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next few minutes were a blur. I walked down the road, not knowing where to go. I was alone, with no cell signal, no one around. The world felt desolate, as if I were the sole survivor of something much bigger than me. Finally, a rescue truck appeared on the road, and I was taken to the hospital. They said it was a miracle I was alive.